You know the saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, in this story, that's not just some figure of speech. Fire on its own is a terrifying thing. It just consumes everything in its path, causing damage you can never undo. But when it's used to get rid of evidence, to hide a crime, the horror just gets so much worse. It all kicked off when neighbors in a perfectly normal apartment building started to notice some black smoke. It had this awful smell, and it was coming from a balcony in an apartment on the second floor. At first, you wouldn't think much of it. Just a young guy grilling on his own patio. The problem was he was doing it nonstop, all day and all night for several days in a row. And honestly, it didn't really look like he was cooking. It looked more like he was just burning something. One of the neighbors got worried because the flames were getting way too close to the balcony roof above. Finally, he'd had enough. He called 911. By the time the firefighters got there, the fire had died down some, and the tenant from apartment 224, he just assured them that everything was under control. Another person living in the building walked right up to the young man and asked him what he was doing out on the balcony. And he just claimed he was cooking for a big event. But that same tenant saw that the guy from 224 had burned through everything in two separate grills and had even dragged the nearest dumpster over to his apartment. This constant burning and the stench that was spreading all over the neighborhood, it was making the entire complex nervous. They were all terrified to find out the truth of what could possibly be behind that relentless smoke. And their fears, God, they weren't for nothing. Because soon, the normal, everyday apartment 224 would turn into a horrifying crime scene. This 19-year-old girl had come home for her spring holidays. She was just so excited about the week ahead, full of fun, seeing her friends, and most importantly, she was getting ready to see her idol, Beyoncé, live in concert. This was supposed to be one of the best nights of her life. She'd made all her plans, done her hair, picked out her outfit, and then all of a sudden she stopped answering calls and texts. From her best friends, her mom, even her college professors couldn't reach her. When the holiday break was over, she didn't show up to her classes. She had just vanished. By the time the police started to piece everything together, it was already too late. What started out as a missing persons case, it turned into something so much more sinister, something so unthinkable that even hardened detectives were just horrified. They said they'd never dealt with anything like it. This is the case of Tynanisha Stewart. Tynanisha Devonis Stewart was born on July 10th, 1987. Her childhood wasn't exactly perfect. Her parents divorced when she was very young, and at just 6 years old, Tynanisha experienced her first real tragedy. Her father died from a brain aneurysm. After the divorce, her mother, Gail, remarried, and Tynanisha got a stepfather who really cared about her. Then her younger sister was born. So the girl grew up in a complete family, where everyone was loved, respected, and valued. The family lived in a place called Borders Village in Texas. Tynanisha grew up a pretty regular kid. She was organized, she was responsible, and she did well in school. In her teenage years, like most kids, Tynanisha struggled a bit with insecurities and self-doubt. She started to butt heads with her stepfather, but as she got older, she learned how to handle her disadvantages and even tried to turn them into her strengths. She had big dreams and this just huge desire to do something really meaningful with her life. Tynanisha went to a high school that was known for its incredible athletes, but Stewart, she wasn't really into sports. Instead, she took on the role of manager for the basketball team, kinda leading the players off the court. She also loved to sing and would perform the national anthem at the games. Inspired by pop music, she and some other girls even started their own singing group at school. Tynanisha somehow managed to balance her classes, her extracurriculars, and she even worked a part-time job. According to her high school principal, she was one of the most ambitious students they had. Every single day she was doing something to get closer to her dream. The biggest goal for Tynanisha was Texas A&M University. She wanted to become a construction engineer. And she had already been awarded several scholarships for a total of $40,000 for graduating high school with honors. Her ambition and her determination to reach her goals, it was phenomenal, which I suppose makes what happened to her all the more devastating. Tynisha's first real boyfriend was a guy named Curtis. He was a handsome, popular boy in middle school, and he was completely devoted to her. All of his attention was focused on Tynisha. He opened doors for her, held her hand, treated her like she was the most important person on earth. She really liked it. They were the couple you'd see at all the school events, and they were together on graduation night. A lot of people were envious of her, wishing they could be in her shoes. But, first love is rarely the last. It's passionate, but very unpredictable. Tynesha and Curtis were kind of on again, off again. The panic just started to build. Tynesha's family knew something serious must have happened because she would never make them worry for no reason. She would have let them know she was okay. Gail called all of her daughter's friends, her former classmates, but no one had heard anything about Tynisha. Then, just in case, her mom dialed the number of her ex-boyfriend, Timothy Shepard, hoping maybe he'd talk to her and knew what her plans were. The guy admitted that he had talked to Tynisha on Thursday night, but that he hadn't seen her after that. That was the night right before the concert. So Timothy was probably the last person who had been in contact with her. Gail couldn't wait any longer. She started her own investigation. She went straight over to Timothy's to talk to him face to face and try to get some more information. And even though the whole family used to love Shepard back when he was with Tynesha now, her mom was cautious around him. She couldn't really explain why. It was just some kind of gut feeling she had. And now that her daughter was gone, that feeling had gotten a lot stronger. Timothy calmly explained to Gail that he'd met up with Tynisha on the night of March 14th, after she was done with her friends. He said he drove over to Lois's apartment to get her. He told Gail that the two of them went back to his place. But then, at 3 o'clock in the morning, her phone rang. Timothy said he knew right away it was her new boyfriend. And in a fit of jealousy, he demanded to know why the guy was calling her at that hour. According to him, Tynesha refused to discuss her relationship with Mark and just left. So his story was that she walked out around 4 or 5 in the morning, just leaving on foot by herself in the total darkness. Then, on Monday, March 19th, Gail went to file an official report about her daughter being missing. She provided the officers with every detail she could. Tynisha Devona Stewart, 19 years of age, standing about 156 centimeters, weighing roughly 54 kilograms, with black hair and brown eyes. As for any identifying marks, she had tattoos on her right thigh and her back. The last time Lois saw her, she was in a white t-shirt with pajama pants that were rainbow colored. Gail was counting on the police to begin moving on it right away, but what happened instead was they were pretty dismissive. The officer's opinion was that an adult woman on spring break might have just gone off somewhere. They sent her mother home and suggested she just wait it out and give them a call after the weekend passed. But Gail knew her daughter. Tynisha wasn't the kind of person who needed to just get away. She was supposed to be at that concert, and right after that, she was due back in her college classes. If Tynesha had decided to go somewhere else, she absolutely would have told her parents. The days started crawling by with no progress at all. There wasn't any news. The family felt they had no other option but to start investigating themselves. They put up flyers, searched the city streets and wooded areas, called every hospital and morgue. They spoke with Tynisha's friends, her classmates, with anyone who might have laid eyes on her. The missing girl's closest relatives were just frantically searching for any small piece of information that might hint at where she was. When the university semester started up again, Tynesha was still officially a missing person. Even her professors were alarmed that such a good student hadn't shown up for class and were attempting to get in contact with her. The family's anxiety was reaching an unbearable level. Getting no assistance from law enforcement and feeling completely lost, they set up a meeting at a Lutheran church to bring community awareness to Tynisha's disappearance. This move, it definitely made a difference. A deputy from the sheriff's department, a guy who worked in the missing persons unit, finally took a serious look at the case. Once he found out the last place Tynisha had been seen was Timothy Shepard's apartment, police went over to the building. Nobody, however, would answer the door. Next, the officers spoke with the complex manager, who let them know that just 2 days prior, there had been a fire inside Shepard's unit. Another neighbor mentioned hearing gunshots from the woods that bordered the property, which led the police to bring in a K-9 team to sweep the area. Almost instantly, the dogs picked up the distinct smell of something decaying, just a short distance from the apartment building. And the closer they moved, the more overwhelming the odor became. It actually turned out that the smell was from a deceased animal. For a brief moment, everyone felt some relief, but that was quickly replaced by dread, because Tynisha was still nowhere to be found. It was then that the sheriff's deputy decided he needed to know more about that fire in Shepard's apartment. He learned that the neighbors had gotten anxious because heavy black smoke had been billowing from the balcony of Unit 224 for hours on end, and then the barbecue grill itself apparently went up in flames. The residents called the fire department, but Shepard refused to let them inside, insisting he was just grilling some meat on his balcony using several grills, and there was no threat. And sure enough, when the firefighters showed up, the fire and smoke were gone. They managed to persuade the young man to let them inside just to confirm there was no danger. And they looked around the apartment. Inside the bathroom, they discovered a mound of melted ice mixed with chunks of meat. They had no clue what kind of meat it was. They were there for a fire. And whatever he was doing in his bathroom wasn't a crime. Frying meat on a grill at your own place also isn't against the law. The firefighters took off, and Timothy got back to what he was doing. Well, at least until that deputy called and told him to come down to the station to be questioned. Shepard gave the detectives the very same account that he had privately given to Tynisha's mother. He was perfectly composed and just kept saying that the girl had left his place after they fought about her boyfriend's late-night phone call. He said she stormed out, slamming the door, and just left on foot without explaining anything. Timothy Shepard was then let go. The Stewart family continued to pray for Tynisha's safe return, but they were getting no answers. They weren't hearing anything from the police and felt like no one gave a damn about their daughter and sister. The community was becoming furious over the clear lack of action from the authorities. There was a strong belief that the media often focuses on missing white girls and does absolutely nothing when the person is Black. Tynisha's sister and cousin had a connection to a public activist named Quanell X, a man known for his work in the Black community and for advocating for justice system reform. He acted as a spokesperson for families who felt ignored by law enforcement. He had a reputation for not being on the best of terms with police agencies. Quanell gave his word he would do everything in his power to find out what happened, and after he got involved, the police really did begin to treat the case with more urgency. Detectives discovered that when she disappeared, Tynisha had been dating a young man named Mark, and they decided to talk to him. At first, Mark didn't answer any of the police's attempts to reach him, but then he called them back himself. He was eventually questioned and told them that on March 17th, he had gone to South Padre Island. The police found it a bit odd that the guy would leave town right after Tynisha went missing. But Mark clarified that he tried to reach her, and she never responded. He claimed that he only learned she was missing once he was already in South Padre. The last known person to see Tynisha alive was her ex-boyfriend, Timothy Shepard. It was on him that the detectives decided to concentrate their efforts. They began to investigate the guy's background, and they started interviewing his neighbors. Timothy was from a pretty respectable family, one with a solid reputation in the community. His mother was a pharmacist. The boy's biological father had passed away when Timothy was just 2 months old, so his stepfather was the one who raised him. The Shepard family were regular attendees at the Missionary Baptist Church. His stepfather was a deacon there, and his mother sang in the choir. Timothy also had a younger sister who was studying law at the University of Houston. By all accounts, the Shepards were a respected, good-natured family. Timothy himself was a father to a 4-year-old daughter, and he actually had full custody of her. People described him as a quiet, reserved, and polite young man. and also a loving dad who truly cared about his child. After he finished high school, Timothy went to a university, but he never actually got a formal degree. On the surface, it looked like he was living a relatively normal life. But detectives discovered that the young man had some past trouble with the law. It had to do with possession of illegal substances. Even though this was before Tynanisha Stewart vanished, investigators decided they needed to get inside Shepard's apartment, especially since he had already given the authorities written permission for a search during his previous interrogation. The moment the detectives walked in, two things hit them immediately. First, the smell, a chemical mix of bleach, ammonia, and something else they couldn't quite identify. And then the odor of fresh paint. It was obvious the person living there had been in a rush to do some work in the kitchen. The cabinets, the walls, the door frames, even the inside of the cupboard under the sink were all coated in white paint. But it was a sloppy job, clearly done in a panic. You could see bleach spots on the carpet. This was a huge red flag that the guy was trying to cover something up. They found a dirty mop and a package of latex gloves. The sink and its drain had been scrubbed clean, and so had the entire bathroom. The whole scene just felt incredibly suspicious. They did, however, find a few small traces of blood, and when they used luminol, it confirmed the investigators' absolute worst fears. The entire bathroom lit up blue. Holy shit. The spots and splatters were everywhere. The floor, the walls, the shower, the toilet seat, the tank, the whole room was just covered in blood. The investigators called in forensic experts who took DNA samples and gathered up all the potential evidence. Since they had to wait for the lab report on what was collected, the detectives went back to canvassing the area and talking to any possible witnesses. Fire reports showed that 911 calls from residents in the apartment complex came in 3 days before Tynisha's mother had even officially reported her missing. One of Shepard's neighbors said she smelled something like burning tires. The flames, she said, were shooting up so high that she was scared for her own apartment. Another neighbor, a guy who often played video games with Timothy, mentioned that they used to grill out together all the time. He'd even left his own grill at Timothy's place. But when Shepard had this big barbecue, he never even invited his friend over. Other people in the building heard banging noises, the sound of water running constantly, and the nonstop whirring of a garbage disposal coming from apartment 224. Little by little, the pieces started forming a deeply disturbing picture. Timothy was looking more and more like the main suspect. Let's get back to the activist, Quanell X. It turned out that he wasn't just connected to Tynisha's family. Shepard's own cousin had also reached out, asking him to help protect Timothy from potential police brutality. By talking with both Tynisha's and Timothy's relatives, Quanell X learned a lot of new things about the young couple's relationship. It had all started out wonderfully. Two people in love, deep feelings, serious plans for a future together, but their relationship soon turned volatile. They started having constant fights and arguments. After Tynisha left for college, she confessed to her family that she was actually scared of Timothy. Shepard was so used to being in control that his jealousy would sometimes spiral way out of bounds. The guy would call her constantly, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. Even after they broke up, Timothy kept calling her roommates to find out what Tynisha was doing in her spare time. And when they wouldn't talk to him, he'd leave these angry messages. The girl kept a lot from her family because she didn't want to make them anxious or have them worry about her. But a friend of Tynisha's admitted that one time. Timothy had grabbed her by the throat, threatening that he would strangle her and then kill her if she ever left him. And when she turned down an engagement ring he tried to give her on Valentine's Day, Timothy supposedly said, as a joke, that one day he would kill her, cook her on a grill, and feed her to the dogs. All of this happened about a year and a half earlier. Since then, things had quieted down a bit, and Shepard had stopped harassing her until February of 2007. About a month before spring break, he started calling again. Tynisha was worried he wouldn't leave her alone. and she even considered not coming back to town at all. But she wanted to see her friends and family so badly that she tried to be calm and friendly with Timothy, just to avoid triggering his aggression. The truth was, Tynanisha still had feelings for him, but she knew they didn't have a future, and that's why she agreed to see him that night, right before she disappeared. Quanell X, wanting to hear Timothy's side of the story, called him up and arranged to meet. When the activist got to Shepard's apartment, Timothy was a wreck. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his eyes were darting all over the place, and the young man just seemed profoundly depressed. Inside the apartment, Quanell noticed all the luminol traces in the bathroom left behind by the forensic team. He looked at Timothy and just asked him if he knew what really happened to Tynanisha. Shepard looked down at the floor and then admitted that the girl wasn't alive anymore. He said he was terrified of dying himself and didn't want to die. The activist urged Shepard to think about the Stewart family, who were desperate for answers, and begged him not to make their suffering any worse. Timothy then led Quanell X to a dumpster behind an apartment building located about 5 kilometers from his own complex. The young man's demeanor changed instantly. He started breathing heavily, his hands twitching nervously. Timothy wouldn't even look at the dumpster. But when they opened it, it was completely empty. By that point, everything inside had already been taken to the landfill. Even though Tynanisha Stewart's remains were never recovered, Shepard was arrested and charged with her murder. For her family, one unbearable pain was just replaced by another. Now, they knew Tynanisha was gone, but they didn't even have the chance to say goodbye or give her a proper burial. At the police station, Timothy initially exercised his right to an attorney, but then he changed his mind. When he was left by himself in the interrogation room, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He wanted to confess to everything. According to Shepard, he and Tynanisha had argued that night over her new boyfriend, Mark. He said the girl didn't like that Timothy was getting involved in her life again. She grabbed a knife that was just sitting on a table and lunged at him, cutting his fingers. Shepard showed the officers a small scratch on his arm and kept going with his story. At first, he said he was afraid Stewart was going to kill him, but then he got angry and went after her. Timothy said it was like he just snapped. He grabbed his ex-girlfriend's throat with his right hand and used his other hand to try and get the knife away. He squeezed her neck until the weapon fell from Tynanisha's hand, and she just collapsed onto the floor. Instead of calling 911, he decided to cover up what he'd done because he panicked, he said, and thought no one would ever believe his side of the story. Knowing the police would be looking for the girl and would find out what happened, Shepard claimed he put her body in a large plastic storage container and threw it in the dumpster that he later showed to Quanell X. When the detectives stepped out of the room, Timothy tried to kill himself. He wrapped a belt around his neck and hooked it onto the door handle. Of course, the attempt didn't work. Meanwhile, the police were trying to figure out what to do next in the search for the body. The landfill covered a massive area. Dozens of tons of garbage were brought there every single day. A search could take months and cost a fortune. And at the same time, the detectives weren't even sure they would ever find Tynanisha's remains. But the real horror was something else entirely. It was far from the whole story because Timothy had left out some very significant details. And he never would have confessed to them if the investigators hadn't figured it out on their own. The police were immediately convinced Shepard was holding back the full story, so they went back to his apartment to perform a much more thorough search, focusing on the balcony. What the forensic experts uncovered was beyond terrifying. They inspected the plumbing in both the bathroom and the kitchen, the spaces between the floorboards on the balcony, and the garbage disposal. Ultimately, they collected a mass of burned hair, tiny slivers of charred bone, fragments of teeth, and bits of scorched skin. Every last piece was sent out for DNA testing. At that point, all anyone could do was wait for the lab results. It became sickeningly clear that after the murder, Timothy had moved Tynanisha's body into the bathroom, dismembered it, and then began the process of destroying the evidence. He incinerated some of the remains on the grill and disposed of the ashes in the garbage. Other fragments of her body were destroyed using the kitchen's garbage disposal. The rest he scattered among various dumpsters. Shepard was occupied with the gruesome task of eliminating his former girlfriend's body for 2 to 3 days. He took advantage of having two separate barbecue grills, likely deciding that burned bones would be far more difficult to identify or ever link back to him. In hindsight, those pieces of meat the firefighters found sitting in the bathtub on a bed of ice that was nothing less than parts of Tynisha's body. Of course, the rescuer in that moment couldn't possibly have fathomed he was looking at human remains. In the meantime, the DNA analysis came back. It showed that the body fragments did indeed belong to 19-year-old Tynisha Stewart. Timothy Shepard was held in prison, with bail set at $250,000. The girl's mother, upon learning the horrific details of what this man did to her daughter, was determined that he be prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. The district attorney was equally resolved to secure a conviction, but the entire case against Timothy was nearly derailed by his defense attorney. His name was Chip Lewis, an incredibly successful lawyer famous for his high-profile cases, including a notorious one where a man killed his neighbor and then dismembered the body. In that trial, Lewis had actually won by proving that the act of dismemberment is not legally the same as the act of murder. Now, Lewis's strategy was to contest every single piece of evidence the prosecution had compiled against Shepard. He focused his argument on the claim that Timothy's confession had been coerced. The lawyer contended that it was supposedly obtained under pressure and that detectives had failed to follow legal protocol. If the attorney had succeeded in defending this position, then none of the evidence discovered in apartment 224 could have been admitted in court. That would have made it profoundly more difficult to secure an indictment. Fortunately, the prosecutor successfully argued against the motion, and the judge denied the defense's request. The trial of 28-year-old Timothy Wayne Shepard began on September 29, 2008. As the prosecutor detailed the specifics of the crime for the public and the jury, Tynisha's family had to endure unimaginable pain, forced to picture exactly what was done to their daughter and sister. The defense strategy centered on the argument that Timothy strangled the girl out of self-defense, and what occurred with her body afterward was a secondary issue. The lawyer attempted to minimize the impact of his client's barbaric and inhuman actions. Regarding the tooth fragments found in Shepard's apartment, he actually suggested that people sometimes lose their teeth, speculating that Tynisha might have accidentally dropped one in the sink before she died. It sounded insane, but that's what defense attorneys do. In rebuttal, the prosecutor offered a chilling clarification. Timothy was terrified of being identified by dental records, so he used a pair of pliers to pull out Tynisha's teeth. This was precisely what the forensic analysis had confirmed. The community activist, Quanell X, also testified. He had promised the murdered girl's family he would fight for justice, and he fulfilled that promise by giving his testimony about everything he had witnessed and been told. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury found Timothy Shepard guilty of murdering his ex-girlfriend. The family and friends of Tynanisha completely broke down in relief and grief. Timothy, however, sat without any reaction, without emotion, like the monster he in fact was. When the time came for his sentence to be handed down, Shepard chose to make a statement. He was trying to appeal to the court for sympathy. Although his lawyer strongly advised him against this unthinkable move, Timothy believed he could persuade everyone that he didn't deserve such a severe sentence. He expressed a desire to return home to his ordinary life, not to lose the best years of his life in a prison cell. Unsurprisingly, his speech failed to generate even a shred of pity. Timothy Shepard was sentenced to 99 years in prison, along with the maximum possible fine of $10,000. It seemed that justice had finally prevailed. Tynisha's mother carried an immense burden of guilt for everything. She hadn't recognized the evil inside Shepard, an evil he kept hidden. She had welcomed that evil into her home and allowed it near her daughter, completely unaware of what that man was capable of. Since her daughter's death, Gail has worked to ensure that other women do not suffer at the hands of their former partners. She tells Tynisha's story and leads discussions focused on healthy relationships. Gail believes that getting involved in your child's life isn't a crime. On the contrary, it's the duty of every parent who values the safety and well-being of their daughter or son.